cater for the constitutional requirement for third gender rule, so we have a good number of ladies within it. Now, we know about CEPIT. Now, the next person who's you've seen from your program, Dr. Tobias Schonwetter. I hope I pronounced it right. Okay. So he's going to come and talk about introduction to intellectual property and also give us an idea of what OpenAIRE is about. Now, Dr. Schonwetter is very qualified, he's widely read, he's widely practiced. He's the Director for Intellectual Property Law and Policy Unit at the University of Cape Town, Law Faculty. He's also the regional director, the regional person for the Africa for Creative Commons Corporation, so he'll explain more about that. And he's also the principal investigator for OpenAIRE. So OpenAIRE does a lot of research and innovation in the African continent. So welcome, Dr. Schonwetter.
Because you don't understand what I'm saying, just raise your hand and let's really make that an interactive session of sorts. So what I wanted to say about the Germanism is that when I was at law school, one of the first things that I was told was kind of a history of law in Germany. And one of the things is that if you go into a German court, you will notice that something is different as compared to many other countries, and that is that the judges sit all on the same level as the people in the courtroom, right? And that was a kind of a 70s thing, because that was the kind of revolution that we had in Germany, which is by no means comparable to what we're going to hear about Egypt today a little bit. But it was kind of, well, let's actually realize that judges are also human beings, and by just putting them on the same footing, we will have a much more engaging conversation in courtrooms than we had before, when the courts were actually the judges were sitting far higher than the people in the audience. And so this is why I'm not so comfortable with standing higher than you, even though if I stand next to Isaac on the same, then I'm probably still standing lower than you are. Okay, I was introduced. Just a recap as to what I'm doing. There's basically three main hats that I'm wearing. Let's start with the ones that are not so relevant for today's session, and that is that I'm the Director of the Intellectual Property Unit at the University of Cape Town. The second one that was mentioned here before, and I'm glad to hear that so many people are familiar with Creative Commons licensing, and if you have questions on that, please feel free to ask me any question, but really your first port of call should really be Isaac when it comes to Creative Commons licensing. And I'm the regional coordinator for Africa, so we heard already that there is a public lead and a legal lead team here in Kenya, and in terms of Creative Commons licensing. And this is how it works on the continent and worldwide. There's country teams, even though the institution itself is US-based. And then the third thing is OpenAIRE, which I'm the principal investigator of. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what OpenAIRE is. And OpenAIRE stands for African Innovation Research. So just a few things. And I tried to make this interactive, and then I'm going to ask you a couple of questions about intellectual property law. So feel, if you don't want to be asked, just look down on your letter and I know that you don't want to be asked here. OpenAIRE in snapshot. So OpenAIRE is a 3-year multidisciplinary initiative on intellectual property in relation to open innovation and collaborative creativity. It's supported by two main funders, and these two main funders are the IDRC in Canada and the German GIZ and the Ministry of Collaboration when it comes to development. It comprises of a network of regional hubs in southern, north, west, and eastern Africa. And while UCT is the southern hub of OpenAIRE, we are now here in Kenya today at the East African hub, and in West African hub we are dealing with an institution in Lagos, and in North Africa we are dealing with American University in Cairo, and you will hear more about that in just a second. Administrative center is at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, as I just mentioned. We collaborate with 13 African countries, and the project, which has much more become a program than a project by now, came out of other project before, which was called the African Copyright and Access to Knowledge Project, which really just focused on copyright, and now the new project is much broader than that. It really covers all aspects of intellectual property, including patents, trademarks, designs, these kind of things. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the case study research that we have been doing in OpenAIRE. When you start a project like this, and it's a 3-year project, it's a big project, it has become a really, really big project. And I'm going to show you the URL later for the website, and please go to that website, because you will see there's so much more to this project than I can ever tell you about in the short period of time that I'm having. But if you start a big project like this, the first question that you really should ask yourself is, whom am I talking to? And so the first question was, what kind of key stakeholders do we have in mind with this project that we are kind of conceptualizing about innovation, creativity, and development in Africa, and then what kind of role intellectual property plays in all of that. And we identified 3 key stakeholder groups, and some of those policy briefs that Isaac just told you about are aiming just at one of them. We're actually not only looking at policy briefs and to inform policymakers, but we also want to have business briefs, because of the kind of key stakeholders that we also have, which are actually innovators, creators and entrepreneurs on the ground. We want to understand and give some sort of guidance from the research that we are doing to the people on the ground, not only to the people in government that are actually informing policies. So it's innovators, creators, entrepreneurs, it's African IP researchers and experts. That to some extent is our network that we are creating, and I'm going to talk more about that too. But then obviously we also want to talk to policy and issue leaders, because at the end of the day not much is gained from a lot of research if nothing of that really has an impact in terms of legislation, policies, and so forth. So these are the key stakeholder groups that we are trying to address with our OpenAIRE project. So the starting point of the project is as follows. Innovation and creativity are key for development. There's no question around that. I think everybody here in the room agrees. But we're not quite sure yet what kind of role intellectual property plays in all of this. And this is what we are trying to investigate with this project. Does it facilitate or restrict innovation and creativity? And the fact is just that at least in Africa, there's very little empirical evidence on that. And this is what we try to address with this project, to get this kind of empirical evidence of what kind of role IP plays. So just can I see by a show of hand, who are the creative people here in the room? Some people said they are creatives. Okay, let me just, very, very simple. If you hear intellectual property from a creator and you're a creator, what do you think? Is that something that helps you as a creator, or is it something perhaps that doesn't? And if not, why not? Have you ever thought of IP? Yes? Okay. And it's something that helps you as an innovator or a creator, or is it rather something where you have run into problems before with? Okay. Okay, that kind of confirms what I'm going to tell you later about some of the findings. Someone here raised your hand. IP, what role plays IP for you as a creative? It protects your work, exactly. So it's helping you. Okay, I saw one more hand also. Creators, 4. Yes? Will you speak up there in the back? Same thing. Okay. Right, so this is what you hear very often, that IP is there to protect the creators and help them to actually monetize some of the stuff that they come up with. But then there's also, if you dig a little bit deeper, you also realize at the beginning of a creation process, whether it just be in the patent field, more the technical field, or whether it's because you're a musician, or whether you are like an author or scholar or whatever, at the beginning of the creation process, often IP actually starts as a stumbling block for your creative process, because you want to we are not creating stuff from scratch these days. All we're doing is basically we're building upon what others have done before. We call that, Google calls that, but it's not Google that came up with them, but it's one of their slogans. We call that standing on the shoulder of giants, right? So basically everything that was created before we use, and then we build upon that. Very, very seldomly these days someone comes up with something that has not been there before. But what does that mean? That means that someone owns this kind of shoulder, or whatever is below that shoulder, and you have to get to that person, get in contact with this person, and then ask for permission. And this kind of permission is usually only given in return for royalties. So, and if you're a small creator, musician, a small-scale musician, you actually have to fork out royalties that you may or may not be able to afford. So it can be a stumbling block. And these are the kind of polarized views that exist in terms of IP. It is something that if you, for example, also if you work in the educational field, that a lot of students go through on a regular basis. Why are textbooks so expensive? Because copyright creates some sort of monopoly in the content of in these textbooks, and that is why these prices are probably higher, and I would actually say they are higher than they usually would be. And this is what a normal kind of following from monopolistic situations and prices. So just to highlight, and I mean, I could go much deeper into that, but this is the kind of starting point that a colleague from Canada and I, based on the results from the previous project, we're talking about. And in fact, the roots of this project are here in Canada, because it was this colleague of mine from Canada and we thought, where can we go where we have a very engaging environment, like what you're trying, Isaac, to create here today, where the kind of thoughts flow freely and where we can come up with a really meaningful project on IP innovation development in Africa. And we decided to come to Kenya because we had a meeting here anyways. And after that meeting was over, we added a week or so, 3-4 days only, and we flew down with this little aircraft that takes you to Masai Mara, and we sat there for 3-4 days and just brainstormed. And this is what came out of that. So really the root of this project are here in terms of thinking in Kenya. So we came up with an overall research question that is as follows. How can IP systems respond to the African context and serve as a tool that facilitate innovation and creativity through collaboration? And what you can see already in there is that we're not saying IP is either bad or good for creativity and innovation. We think of ways of, okay, let's accept the situation as it is, and let's try to find ways of using IP in a way that really benefits the stakeholders that we have identified, and most importantly, entrepreneurs and creators on the ground. And this was our research hypothesis. No research project without a proper research hypothesis, right? So we say African innovation and creativity, and therefore development, is being constrained by suboptimal IP-related policies and practices. Let me give you a little bit of a snapshot of what OpenAIRE is about. This is what we're doing. We're not doing, obviously we're doing research. 19 case studies that we're doing all in all, from all areas of IP. Some in the area of patents, some in the area of copyright, some about trademarks. But then we also have cross-cutting areas, or areas where there is actually no formal category of IP, but it is kind of falling into the scope of IP. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that just in a second. Second very interesting element, and again you will hear more about that on a slide that will follow, is the foresight element of our research. Foresight-driven scenario building. What we're doing is we generate 3 scenarios for the future. How could the future look like if we deal with IP in a certain manner? So 3 different scenarios. I will also give you a teaser on that. We have not quite yet there to give you some results on that because the research is ongoing, but I think it's an extremely interesting part of our research, for the simple reason that research, in case study research, is always kind of caught in the present, or probably even more so in the past. And then you're trying maybe to make a recommendation for the immediate future. But this foresight-driven scenario is looking not 1 year or 2 years, 3 years, or 5 years ahead, it's looking 30 years ahead, and try to come up with 3 different possible scenarios for how the world might look like 30 years from now on if we deal with IP and other things in a certain manner. Outreach, training, capacity building, super important to us. Not only for us as project leaders, but also for one of our funders, the GIZ, the Germans. They are more interested, they are not so much interested in the research part of that, but they are really interested in feeding the research results into something like what we are doing here today. Having a workshop, telling you a little bit more about these. Capacity building generally. IP is an issue that is not yet very high on the agenda in many African countries, as Isaac just said, but we're getting there. And capacity building is one of these important things that need to happen, because otherwise we cannot have a meaningful discussion on intellectual property if we do not know what we really are talking about. And then network building is related to that. I just alluded to that. I spoke to that. Case studies designed to reflect status quo, identify existing problems, challenges, opportunities in those kind of 6 research, general research areas that we have identified. But then the foresighting, very exciting. Let's look into the future. It's actually 20 years from now. I said 30, it's 20 years from now. And let's try to see if we take these identified problems and opportunities into account that we have identified with the case study research. What does that mean? What could happen in the next 20 years from now? And this is not something that we have come up with, and it has also very little to do, even though it sounds like it, with looking into a glass ball and like kind of making a guess or something, or predict. The word prediction is actually methodologically something that you should not use in foresight research. So we're doing something that others have done before us. We are obviously we have to kind of tweak it to suit our purposes, but institutions like the European Patent Office, and that is obviously something that we're interested in because it's also an IP institution, they have done something like this for their institution. Shell has done that more on a private sector basis for their organization, and they have tried to identify and build scenarios for how the world could look like in 20 years, obviously, in their industry. So we are building on their experience in this field. We actually have the same consultant on the team that did the one at least for EPO. And in December 2013, so a couple of months from now, we will be in a position to actually publish these, officially publish these scenarios. So far, I can only give you a teaser in that I can tell you what the 3 kind of headings for those scenarios are. The one is resource curse to resource blessing. The second one is wireless engagement, and the third one is sincerely Africa. And while it sounds as if it's like from bad to good, it's really not. Every scenario has something good in it and something bad in it. So we're not trying to really just build a very bleak picture of Africa in 20 years from now and a very good one, but we're trying to have 3 equally good or bad scenarios that we're dealing with here. Outreach, training, capacity building. We have internal and external activities in this respect. Our internal capacity building, outreach and training activities include fellowship programs. So we have people coming to Cape Town, young, promising, kind of emerging scholars in the field of IP from Africa that come for a certain period of time, 3 months, some were there for longer. Nacham is going to come at the end of the year as well from the University of Cairo. And they work with us on open air. Obviously, earlier in the project, those fellows were involved in more in the research part of that. Now that we have shifted gears a little bit with the project, the fellows are more involved in the kind of capacity building and feeding our findings into whatever we are building now. And also in relation to planning of a conference that I'm going to tell you more about now. This is what our fellows do at the moment, and they so far really did enjoy coming to Cape Town and working with us on these things. Internal. Second one, research methodology support. Something that we did not think of at the beginning, at the outset of the project. So we thought we're just going to identify a lot of researchers, some of them that we have worked with before, some of that we do not have worked with before, and then we just tell them, do you want to do a case study? Give us a proposal, we see whether it fits our purposes, and then we take it from there. But then we realized 2 things. First, there is this kind of scarcity of IP scholars in Africa, so it was not that easy to first find these people. And secondly, we did not want to just do IP research. We actually wanted to have an interdisciplinary team, as you could see at the beginning. So we have not only lawyers on the team, or legal scholars, we have business people and even some creatives in the team. But they come all with a background, methodological background that is not very compatible. So for example, try to tell a legal scholar to conduct interviews in their research. That sounds to most social science people like bread and butter, right? It's the most normal thing that you can possibly think of. Now, doing a proper research methodology when it comes to interviewing data subjects is actually a fairly complicated thing. I knew very little about that before the previous project, because that was the first where I was involved in this kind of work. So it's not just like, oh, you know, you look interesting, or you look interesting, and I ask you a couple of questions, and then I write them down, right? This is going to be taken apart from the whole community, because it's just the sampling method behind that is just not strong enough to, I mean, you can call it anecdotal evidence, which is the easy way out of that, but it's just not good enough, right? So we realized, hey, we need to actually clue up our own network on some of these research methodologies to really get something at the end of the time, a day that is meaningful and is strong enough to hold. So we did a couple of workshops just around methodology. Third one, Capacity Builder Fund. We put some money away in our project that people from our network that we built, and it's a network of about 100 people, if not more. If people are interested, they are saying, okay, I heard about this crucial conference now we had a colleague just now who said, I need to go to a conference in Italy. There is something, they just talk about the issues that I've been involved in my research for this project, and there is they're interested in having me, but they cannot pay for me, because I'm not yet as high level, and their funding sources are relatively limited. So we have put money specifically aside for people to apply for these kind of activities, that they can say, please, can we not come and go to this? It will help me personally, but I think I can also use that as a means of spreading the word more about the project and some of our findings. I like the fact that you have a Creative Commons sticker there on your laptop. That's wonderful. So this is internal for our network. Externally, we're doing outreach seminars and workshops. Believe it or not, you're sitting in one at the moment, right? So this is part of our whole initiative to talk about our project. Very interesting, maybe for some people that are here in the Strathmore community. One of the outputs is that we are building a curriculum around the research that we have been doing with OpenAIRE. We're doing that at the University of Cape Town. So the University of Cape Town will run a pilot at the second semester of this year on this project, some of the findings. But the nice thing is that because it's the project, not the university, that develops that, we actually requested that this is going to be an open course. So in other words, we create a so-called replication toolkit in which we not only give potential lecturers or teachers more background on the subject matter, but we actually really give all the material that we can so that people can replicate that course somewhere else. As I said, we call that replication toolkit, and we really do hope that some other universities will take that once it's out there and will teach on that, and maybe invite even members of our network that did the actual research. So I think that will also, in terms of sustainability of the network, help our network to be alive longer than the project actually lasts. Major international conference in December 2013 in Cape Town. There's an annual conference that is called Intellectual Property, the Global Congress on Intellectual Property and the Public Interest. 2 years ago it was in Washington DC. Last year it was in Rio de Janeiro. This year it's going to be in Cape Town, 9th to 13th December. Those of you who are interested from more like an academic point of view in that, please mark that and go also to our website again. It's a big event for the IP community that is interested in public policy consideration when it comes to IP. And then we have a lot of social media offerings, website, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, alumni portals, newsletter, whatever you can think of, just to engage with our communities. And we have policy and business briefs, as I said earlier. I always hope that from these kind of meetings and gatherings, we're getting more food for these policy briefs. We can think of a couple of things that we believe are useful for you to know and put into these policy briefs. But actually, at the end of the day, it is you who need to tell us what you think you need to know and where your questions are, and then we try to give you some answers in these policy briefs. Talked about the network. This is we continuously monitor our network. So what we are trying to really achieve with our network is that we have taken 3 or 4 key people out of the project, like the project leaders or the project manager. We don't want the whole network to see collapsing, right, and nothing happens anymore. That's why we're doing these kind of funky looking things. But at the end of the day, what that is supposed to show you is that even though the activity is less, even if we took out lead researchers, principal investigators, and project manager, there would still be interactions going on because other people have actually come up in the network and played important roles to keep the network alive. And then we have the hubs that I alluded to in Cairo, in Nigeria, in Lagos, here obviously, and then in South Africa. These are the kind of the 6 thematic case study areas. I said already copyright, patent, trademarks. We look at TK, which is something that is particularly important, I believe, on the African continent. We look at IP from publicly funded research. For those who are interested in these kind of things, what that means is that there is a new movement, unfortunately from South Africa, I should say, on the African continent at least, that says that research that comes from a publicly funded research institution must be protected, or they say commercialized by means of IP. So in other words, if there is anything coming out, patents or copyrightable material, it needs to be protected by means of intellectual property. Sounds great at first. If you dig a little bit deeper, it is actually a big problem because why should you, that means that you have to pay again if you want to access the material that comes out of universities. And why do I say pay again? Because you have already paid for that, because it's taxpayers' money that is actually going to universities, and they create this material with this taxpayers' money. So we have our problems with that, but the general ratio to say, okay, you're getting money, we want to see something in return, I can understand, but I think there's better ways of dealing with that, and we may actually talk about that a little bit later. And then we also look at something more international with the wider development agenda. Last time when I spoke about the project, I read the slide out. That was, I think, the most boring part of the presentation. I could see people like, okay, so I'm not going to do that again. It's on the website. There is those six themes, and you see now the 19 case studies that are linked to these 6 themes of our OpenAIR project. Just a few minutes on kind of the first sort of conclusions that came out of our research. And this is really brand new because this is just coming in. Our case studies were very recently only finalized, and we had now time to actually really go into them. And while all of these case studies had their own research questions, we also obviously hope that these research questions will then enable us to answer our overarching research question for the entire project, which I told you before. So these are a couple of things that I picked out which I found intriguing from all of these case studies. So the first one is that the African context seems to be predisposed towards innovation of necessity rather than, accidental innovation, some call that, rather than oriented towards so-called frontier or high technology innovation. So you innovate because you have to, not because you want to do something great, but it's because there is a need in your community, you invent to address these needs. Second, the orthodox categories of IP remain often ill-equipped to appropriately deal with innovation originating in Africa. What do I mean with that? Just a good example. Let's talk about copyright for a second, right? Copyright requires as basic requirements for IP protection that there's an identifiable author and that the work needs to be written down, among other things, right? So now look at a lot of stuff that comes from the African continent, like songs, for example, that are sung, not written down, that are old and that are actually existing in a community, not so much being composed by one person. It does not fulfill any of these requirements, and therefore it does not attract copyright protection. So it just does not gel very well, right? Traditional knowledge is another thing. There is now efforts in Africa to kind of create laws that deal specifically with TK. I'm not sure how far we are here in Kenya, but it's still, you can see if they really try to make this part of the existing framework of IP, patents, for example, it's just really not working very well. You have to come up with a very complex legislative framework to sort of give the protection that those people do want. So we believe that there is other ways of perhaps dealing with that better. We call it, for example, sui generis, or a protection, or protection of a special kind, that it does not have to be a patent or copyright or trademark or something like that. And then the institutional infrastructure for research and development IP management is often poor in many countries. We actually looked at all patent offices on the African continent. One of our researchers did, and if you want to read one of those case studies, I think you should really look into that one, because the language is very strong. He was very disappointed by what he saw at the IP offices on the African continent. He says, you cannot meaningfully really protect your IP in many African countries because there's just no one you can really talk to. And these 3 points, you often hear internationally that Africa is less innovative than other continents. And we believe that these 3 points that we have unearthed also, and somewhat also just confirmed something that was there before, that these 3 points lead to that perception that Africa is less innovative. Because these kind of songs that I alluded to, they are just not captured by IP, right? Or because there is just not this high technology kind of innovation going on, because that is not what is needed on the African continent at this point in time. And then obviously if you can't protect it because there is no workable IP institution on the ground that does the registration of patents, then you have less patents. And oftentimes the number of patents is used as the kind of benchmark for measuring of how creative and innovative a country is, which I think is a flawed system in itself. Now, what the case studies do, they kind of present a middle ground. They're not saying IP is bad or good. Again, and we expected that. Even though at the beginning perhaps we thought, okay, we will come up with the answer that for Africa IP just doesn't work. But this is not the case. It really differs for the area of IP, for the country that you're looking on, for the kind of industry that you're looking on. But some of the case study, which can only be just an example of things that is happening on the ground, they provide you with a compromise. A little bit of protection here, but then also keep stuff open and make that part of your business model. Isaac mentioned that earlier, freemium model, and I will mention that just now again, and you will hear that in other presentations. Formal and informal collaboration with varying degrees of openness are crucial engine for innovation and development in many African countries. So, what also came out of those case studies is that the impact of IP, and this kind of confirms what you said earlier. You said that that's really started only recently to affect you, right? Impact of existing IP laws remains to this point relatively minimal. IP policy context is divorced from actual innovation practices, so the policies say one thing, what's happening on the ground is totally different. It just it's not aligned with each other very well yet. And IP policy making generally in many African countries, not in all, and Kenya is probably further up there in terms of development of IP policy making, but in many African countries it's still in its infancy stage, which is, on the one hand, could be good, because you can start from a clean slate in a way, and come up with a really good IP policy that takes all this into account what I just talked about, or it can be really bad, because you just listen to like some other countries that believe if you had a certain IP policy here in Kenya, it would actually help them, not you as Kenya. So there's this temptation to just copy IP policies that are not made for the country and for the circumstances in the country. So be careful on that. So let me finish off with like very, very few recommendations. The first one, very basic, avoid policy mistake. In our view, and that comes out of the research I believe, is it is worse to have no IP policy at all than having the wrong or ill-suited IP policy. Africans will continue to innovate. They already do. But poorly designed IP policies, if we had those, may actually kind of hamper this innovation process. Second thing, broaden the conception of relevant and valuable IP practices. So informal, or I mentioned that term earlier, sui generis modes of IP protection. For example, keep your stuff secret at the beginning. Just don't talk so much at the beginning at it is sometimes more effective than aiming to get formal protection in the way of patent protection, for example. Or use branding instead of, which is a lower key protection than patent protection, I suppose. And so these seem to be sometimes or oftentimes actually better suited than formal modes of patent, copyright, or trademark protection. And then finally, look forward, no backwards. I mean, we all know this has now made the press all over. I think The Economist was one of the last saying Africa is rising. So we're actually coming from a situation of strength and not from a situation of weakness at the moment. If you look what's happening elsewhere, I think Africa is one of the positive examples of movement, of progress, of moving upwards rather than stagnating or going downwards. So let's keep this in mind. Africa is rising. Rather than giving into external pressure from other countries to apply those kind of orthodox models of IP protection, let's come up with our own way. Let's look what we need on our continent and be strong about that. And that just happened last week. I was in Marrakesh last week. For the first time, there was an international treaty concluded that for the first time focused on user rights rather than the rights of the IP holders. In other words, it's just a small group that they were talking about. It was for the blind people and for visually impaired people, but those people now have an international treaty that puts it into a treaty and later hopefully then in the law of the member countries that they can under certain circumstances more freely access existing IP and copyrighted material than they were before, to overcome some of the problems that they are facing in accessing existing material, to do exactly what I mentioned earlier, stand on the shoulder of giants and continue working from there on. Thank you very much. This is the website. Thanks. This is the website, www.openair.org.za. I can't read it, but I'm sure you can't either, but this is the website. And the second thing, just a reminder at the end of this is Cape Town. This is our stadium. Nobody uses it at the moment, by the way, so I really think I should put some water in there. We had a swimming pool, that would be better. Table Mountain in the back, December, we have our Global Congress on IP and the public interest. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Dr. Chandraka. I'm sure that was a lot to take in. But some things I've gotten, especially in terms of some of the things you talk about your research, is there's usually a disconnect between what the IP laws can be able to do and what people experience on the ground. So I hope for the innovators, for the creatives, for the entrepreneurs in the room,